So if your job involves counting up and reporting greenhouse gas emissions, you already know that credibility is absolutely everything. As an ISO 14641 lead verifier, I have seen it all. I've seen inventories that are rock solid, and I've seen ones that just, well, they fall apart the second you look at them closely. Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on the standard that underpins all of this work, ISO 14641. And we're not just going to read it, we're going to really understand it from an auditor's point of view. Think of this as your guide to building a GHG inventory that's truly bulletproof. We're always hearing about the big picture goals, right? Countries stand up on the world stage and make these huge pledges, like hitting net zero by 2070. And that's fantastic. It's critical. It sets the direction for all of us. But here's the thing. Those giant national targets are really just the sum of millions of smaller actions happening right down here on the ground.
Okay, so that brings us to the real question, doesn't it? How do we take a massive national goal and actually translate that into something a single company can act on and measure? How does any given organization know what it's supposed to count, how to count it, and then how to report it in a way that everyone, regulators, investors, the public, can actually trust? That exact problem is why ISO 14064-1 exists. So to really get our heads around this standard, we're going to walk through it just like a verifier would during an audit. First, we'll talk about the why, the whole point of this. Then we'll cover the 5 guiding principles that shape every single decision. After that, we dive into the nuts and bolts, setting your boundaries, sorting out your emissions, doing the actual math, and finally, putting together a report that's ready for a tough audit. So why do we even have this standard? Well, in one word, trust. Just for a second, imagine a world without it. Company A might count the emissions from its delivery trucks, but Company B doesn't. Company C might use an emission factor from 10 years ago, while Company D uses the latest one. What you'd get is total chaos. Just a bunch of numbers that you can't compare and, frankly, you can't believe. ISO 14064-0 fixes that. It creates a level playing field, a standardized rulebook that helps turn messy corporate data into information that's actually reliable. All right, before we touch a single number, we have to talk about the principles. These are laid out in Section 4 of the standard, and from my perspective as an auditor, they are the absolute heart of the whole thing. Every choice you make, from the data you pick to the way you write your report, has to stand up to these 5 ideas. They're what ensures your final report is a true and fair account. Okay, let's look at these from my side of the desk. First up, relevance. This just means you've picked the right data and methods for the people who are actually going to read your report. Makes sense, right? Next, completeness. Oh, this is a big one. It means you have to include all relevant emissions inside your boundary. You can't just forget about that one factory with the bad record keeping. If it's in, it's in. Third is consistency. This means you use the same methods year after year so you can actually track your progress. We need to know your emissions went down because you made a change, not because you changed the math. Fourth, accuracy. The standard is smart here. It says you have to reduce guesswork as much as is practicable. It knows perfection isn't possible, but you have to show you tried your best. And finally, transparency. This is the one that makes my job as a verifier possible. You have to document everything, your assumptions, your data sources, the whole shebang. Without that clear trail of breadcrumbs, your report just isn't credible. Okay, with those principles in our back pocket, the very first thing you have to do is define your boundary. Seriously, when I walk in to start an audit, my first question is always, what company are we actually looking at today? You have to draw a really clear line around the operations you're including. This is step 1, and it sets the stage for everything else. The standard calls this the organizational boundary. And honestly, the best way to think about it is to compare it to financial accounting. When a big parent company puts together its annual financial report, it has to decide which of its smaller companies and joint ventures get included. GHG accounting is exactly the same. You have to clearly define which facilities are in the report and which are out. Now, the standard gives you a really important choice here, and it's a choice you shall, that's mandatory language, make, and then stick with. Your first option is operational control. This is usually the simplest. If you run the place, if you set the rules, you count 100% of its emissions. Easy. Your second option is equity share. This lines up more with the finance department. If you own 40% of a facility, you count 40% of its emissions. This is great for companies with a lot of complex investments. The absolute key here is you have to pick one and apply it everywhere. As a verifier, one of the first things I check for is cherry picking. Using one method here and another there just to make your numbers look better. That's a huge no. All right, so you've drawn that line around your whole organization. You know which buildings and facilities are included, so what's the next logical step? Well, you have to look inside that boundary and start mapping out every single place that greenhouse gases are coming from. Then, the standard requires you to sort them into very specific categories. At the highest level, we split emissions into two main buckets. You've got your direct emissions. These come from sources you own or control, like the furnace in your building or the cars in your company fleet. Then you have indirect emissions. These happen because of what you do, but the source is owned by someone else. The classic example is the electricity you buy. The emissions happen at a power plant somewhere else. Now listen up, because this is a really crucial point. You've probably heard of Scope 1, 2, and 3 from the GHG protocol. Well, ISO 14064-1 calls them categories. They mean the same thing, just different names. Don't let the terminology trip you up.
The standard lays the categories out very neatly. Category 1 is all your direct stuff, what the GHG protocol calls Scope 1. Think fuel you burn on site. Category 2 is just for indirect emissions from the energy you buy, like electricity. That's your Scope 2. And then you've got categories 3 through 6. This is the big bucket for all other indirect emissions, what everyone calls Scope 3. It's huge. It covers everything from the products you buy to employee travel to the waste you throw out. And this is the moment where, as a verifier, I know you'd better have read Annex B of the standard. Annex B isn't just extra reading, it is essential guidance. It's packed with examples to help you figure out where things go. A really common audit failure I see is people miscategorizing something simply because they didn't check Annex B. So we've set our boundary, we've categorized all our sources. The next logical step is to actually crunch the numbers. Yep, it's time to do the math. Believe it or not, almost all greenhouse gas calculation boils down to this one simple formula. You take your activity data. That's just how much of something you did. Say you use 10,000 liters of diesel fuel. That's your activity data. Then you multiply that by an emission factor. That's just the amount of greenhouse gas that gets released for every unit of that activity. So for diesel, a good factor might be 2.68 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per liter. You multiply your 10,000 liters by 2.68, and you get 26,800 kilograms of CO2 equivalent. That's it. Every calculation follows that same basic logic. Now, your activity data is usually pretty simple. It comes right off your fuel bills or your electric meter. Where I, as a verifier, spend a lot of my time is looking at your emission factors. The standard is incredibly strict about this. See how it uses the word shall for every single one of these points? That means these are not suggestions. Your factor shall come from a recognized source, like the IPCC or a government agency. It shall be the right one for what you're doing. You can't use a gasoline factor for diesel. And it shall be current. I can't tell you how many times I see reports using factors that are 5 or 10 years old. The science changes, your factors have to be up to date. It all comes down to being able to prove it. I'm going to ask you where you got every single factor, and if you can't show me, that's a problem. Okay, so you follow all of these steps. You set your boundary, you categorize everything, you carefully do the math, and it all leads to this one final output. It culminates in your official GHG report, or what the standard calls a GHG assertion. This is the document where you present your findings to the world and get ready for someone like me to come have a look. The whole reason you go through the trouble of using ISO 14064-1 is to create a document that's built on those 5 principles we talked about: relevance, completeness, consistency, accuracy, and transparency. When you follow the rules for boundaries, categories, and quantification, you end up with a final report that's solid, defensible, and totally ready for an independent audit. It's not just about getting a number, it's about getting a number you can stand behind with confidence. And that brings us right to the final piece of the puzzle, the audit itself. See, ISO 14064 is actually a family of standards. Part 1, the one we've been talking about, is your rule book for building the inventory. But ISO 14064-3, that's my rule book. It's the standard for the verifier. It tells me exactly how to plan and conduct the audit, what I need to look for, and how I form my final opinion. They really are two sides of the same coin. Part 1 says you need to be transparent. Part 3 says I have to check that transparency. Part 1 says you need accurate emission factors. Part 3 says I have to verify where you got them. If you understand Part 1, you'll be perfectly prepared for the questions I'm required to ask you from Part 3. So, there you have it. We've walked through the entire logic of ISO 14064-1, from the core principles all the way to the final verified report. We've seen how it gives you a clear, structured, and really defensible way to do corporate carbon accounting. My hope is that after this, you can open up that official standard document and see it not as some intimidating rulebook, but as what it really is, a logical tool that you are now absolutely ready to use.